Hey guys, welcome back to the Quad Method. My name is Steven, and in this video we're going to be talking about the X and the Y axis. You might have heard me use these terms in my previous videos, and you may have heard it from a teacher, but basically we're going to talk about playing quads just like we're looking at a grid. Hope you enjoy. Quad playing can be very convoluted and complicated, and I get it. I've been there and I'm still there. Just with all the things I've learned about quads, the more I learn, the more challenging it gets to teach that or translate that to less experienced quad players. Just one thing leads to another thing, and then that thing leads to another thing, and then there's all these exceptions. What we're about to talk about hopefully will help you compartmentalize playing quads. So we're going to start with the y-axis, which is the most important one. Nothing will ever be more important than what the y-axis consists of. And the y-axis constitutes everything that has to do with rhythms and sound quality and technique, and basically whatever you know about drumming up and down, that's basically the y-axis for quads. Other instruments don't really have to talk about the y-axis, or they don't have to think about it like that, because that's the only way they move, up and down. But luckily for those of you that teach, you don't have to teach the y-axis to quads any differently than you teach it to snare drummers. They're basically just the same thing, minus the traditional stuff. But the way anything that has to do with, using finger, using wrist, using elbow, rhythmic accuracy and sound quality and tone, your velocity, your weight, all that stuff, again, all y-axis. When I talk about vertical motion or vertical anything, that's always referring to the y-axis. I sometimes mention vertical motion simply because I have to separate the up and down stuff from the side to side stuff. The y-axis takes precedence over anything else, or over the x-axis, because what is the point of what we do? We do what we do because we want to play accurate rhythms and play those rhythms with quality, good sound quality. All the flashy stuff in terms of just playing scrapes and moving around and doing these like really fancy motions, like that's all well and good, but if you can't play that with decent quality, then it doesn't really mean too much. It's just kind of like you're trying to make it sound good, but in the end it doesn't work. But the y-axis is also important because if you want to talk about rhythmic accuracy and technique and how to move the bead or how to move the stick in general, that conversation has to come first, because when I'll get to the x-axis in a second, the x-axis basically all it does is just move what the y-axis is doing. So all that sound quality and all that rhythmic accuracy and all that stuff, hopefully that is retained as you move around the drums. And that's the goal, right? We don't want to have two separate techniques, one for one drum and then one for the rounds, because that would just get really messy, and then that would just make quad playing even more complicated than it already is. Now let's go ahead and move to the x-axis. So the thing that makes quad special is the x-axis, the ability to play on different drums that produce different pitches. That is what quad playing is all about. The x-axis is always secondary to the y-axis. The x-axis is basically analogous to a transportation system. If the y-axis was the contents of your vehicle, then the x-axis are the wheels that move that around the drums. If your y-axis is not strong, if it's not secure, then the x-axis is just going to amplify that insecurity and just make everything sloppy and just not accurate. Which is why the y-axis always has to take precedence over the x-axis. The x-axis is supporting what the y-axis is doing. And a weird analogy I like to use is, I think of a tank. If you think of the y-axis as the cannon and the x-axis as the treads basically move the cannon, right? It moves the cannon to different locations, but just because it's moving to different locations, the cannon doesn't shoot any differently than it would if it was just not moving at all. However, if it's trying to hit the same target while it's moving, it's got to rotate its turret a little bit to kind of compensate for its movement, right? And that's the same thing with quad drumming, is that even though we're trying to maintain the y-axis the whole time as it would be on one drum, we sometimes have to make slight exceptions, and we have to round the edges out a little bit to make sure that it stays smooth while moving around the drums. If you hear me talk about horizontal motion, or just typically usually motion in general, that's usually in regards to the horizontal stuff. Anything that has to do with moving your arms back and forth or just visually making stuff smooth, usually that has to do with this. So to summarize, the x-axis is basically just anything that has to do with moving the stick back and forth. All it does is change the pitch of what you're playing. It doesn't change how you're hitting into the head. It only changes where you're hitting the head. Now let's really quickly kind of go over how the X and Y axis kind of work together. So we want to try to keep both of them separate. At least for me, I like to keep them separate because they both have different responsibilities. The y-axis has the responsibility of producing good sounds with rhythmic accuracy. The x-axis only has the responsibility of changing the pitch of what you're playing. However, one should not affect the other. Realistically, that doesn't really happen, but we want to try to make that hypothetical as realistic as possible. The more you can make that happen, the more you could focus on, one thing or the other. We can talk about your vertical mechanics, and we don't have to worry about that changing while you're moving around the drums. That's why we keep them separate. We don't want the x-axis, like in our previous tendencies video, we don't want the motion affecting how we're hitting into the head. And in that same way, we don't want to let how we hit into the head slow us down when we're moving side to side. So again, they're separate, but they're connected by just something that allows us to move around the drum smoothly while still maintaining good sound qualities and rhythmic accuracy. And honestly, most of that comfort comes from the performer. Like if you're a performer, it is your job to figure out how to get those two things to work with each other. I do think it's really important to get good at the y-axis stuff first, and then figure out how to move that around the drums. Because if you don't have a solid foundation for what your y-axis is going to be, and you start trying to move that, then this is going to start falling apart. And we don't want that. That means we're totally compromising just how we hit into the head. But yeah, so hopefully that helps. If you're a teacher, I think this is a good way to think about it. You don't even have to talk about the x-axis. Your students should, figure that out for themselves as they play, around vocabulary. Basically, I think it's important for the tech's job to emphasize how important it is to hit the drum the same way, and the right way while moving around the drums. Me personally, in high school, I didn't have a quad tech while I was in high school, but the teachers I did, they heavily emphasized just don't change how you're hitting into the head for this motion stuff, and that really helped me retain my sound quality and make it better as I went on to play quads more and more and more, and then post high school drum corps stuff. If you have any questions about that, or if I made this too complicated, please let me know. I tried to simplify it as much as I could. I don't know if I did the best job at it, but I could always remake this video in a much simpler way or post something short. So let me know if you would like that. And if not, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.